When Chuck Schumer told Senator John Kennedy to sit down, boy, he thought the debate was over. But 37 seconds later, Kennedy's calm reply would silence the entire Senate and leave even Schumer's own party stunned. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the debates they never expected to be caught on camera. It began like any other Senate budget session. Tense, procedural, half the chamber on their phones, half pretending to listen. Outside, the country was growing restless. The government had been shut down for weeks, and Americans were demanding answers. Inside, two men prepared to give them a show they'd never forget. Chuck Schumer, polished as the podium, measured in cadence and calibrated in emphasis, treating the budget like a patient to be stabilized rather than a battlefield to be conquered. John Kennedy, almost languid in posture, the hint of a drawl like a well-worn tool he could sheath or brandish at will. More interested in arithmetic than applause and yet perfectly aware of the camera's appetite for a clean line. The script was supposed to be procedural. A temporary bridge, a narrow span of funding over a canyon no one wanted to admit was there. Healthcare credits extended for a year. Agencies reopened with an IOU. Negotiations postponed to a theoretical calmer day. Stability, Schumer called it. Predictability, duty, the language of a town that loves to put future tense on present problems. He summoned bipartisan ghosts, past deals, old appropriations, packages that came with ribbon and press conference schedules. He offered calm like it was currency. And yet the country beyond the seal and the velvet rope wasn't looking for calm. It was looking for clarity. Not a ceasefire, a verdict. Polls didn't capture it. The murmurs in union halls and church basements did. People who didn't know a continuing resolution from a continuing education course understood the rhythm of a paycheck gone missing. They recognized a stall, even when a suit called it consensus. Kennedy knew it, not because staff had told him but because he'd been repeating versions of it in smaller rooms for years. He had built a reputation on lines that stuck because they sounded like things people actually said when they weren't being watched. The paradox was obvious and useful, in a building famous for words. The lines that live longest are the ones that don't try so hard. He had come prepared to argue numbers and priorities. He had also come prepared for television. Both could be true. The provocation arrived almost by accident. An inflection caught wrong by a microphone. A phrase that read like reprimand when filtered through a nation already suspicious of tone. The Senate has rules for everything except how a word lands in a tired country. One sentence, clipped and dismissive, became a kind of spark in a dry field. It wasn't even the worst thing said in that chamber that week. Not by a mile, but it sounded like something said from height to someone below. And that is the sort of slope the public recognizes with uncomfortable speed. Kennedy didn't reach for thunder. He reached for stillness. The small mechanics of the moment made themselves visible. The set of his shoulders. The neat stack of yellow paper squared to the edge of a desk scarred by 100 forgotten fights. The deliberate choice not to rush, not to answer with heat. He let the room feel itself. The gavel's echo could not fill the gap. The vice president's brow furrowed at the script going off script. Pages stalled mid-aisle. Even the red lights atop the cameras seemed to burn a little brighter. As if machines knew when a thing might matter. The first 10 seconds were disbelief disguised as decorum. The second 10 held calculation. Journalists priming quick edits. Aides tapping out rescue lines. Rivals judging the optics like card counters weighing the table. The third 10 became something else. A shared recognition that silence, when chosen rather than enforced, can be an argument all its own. Not surrender. Not shock. A choice. The final 7 were a fuse. Timing governs more political damage than ideology does. Kennedy understood the physics of a pause. He had no need to fill space merely to prove it was his. He let the tension accumulate like static until the air itself felt brittle. And then he did what entertainers and litigators and boxers do when they've drawn a crowd tight enough to listen with their bones. He released a single. simple measure that cut through the murmuring calculus of Washington and translated into the American dialect of bills and bags of groceries and tanks of gas. The chamber reacted the way organisms do when startled: flinch, noise, order trying to reassert itself. But the sound was no longer the point. The center of gravity had shifted. The moment didn't end inside the room. It flowed outward, across wires and screens, from the clipped feed of a government network to handheld edits with captions in 30-point font. Within minutes, it no longer belonged to the Senate at all. It belonged to anyone holding a phone and an opinion. Context limped behind. That is the rule now. What was said exactly? How was it meant? What did the parliamentarian advise in the previous exchange? None of it could catch the clip. The internet prefers pictures to footnotes. And the frame was irresistible. A leader of the minority, precise and managerial, and a senator from Louisiana converting arithmetic into parable. A town built on words had been upstaged by the absence of them. But to freeze the image, there would miss the larger topography. The shutdown hadn't merely closed parks and museums. It had exposed a fissure between the way Washington performs compassion and the way the rest of the country counts it. Schumer's argument mapped onto spreadsheets and case studies, a lifeline, a bridge, a mitigation of harm. Kennedy's counterargument mapped onto kitchen tables, a ledger of outflow and intake. A sense that the word temporary had become a permanent excuse. The two vocabularies rarely meet. When they do, it's the sound of steel on stone. The chamber learned something that morning about attention. It can't be ordered, only earned. And the way to earn it is not always through volume. Kennedy's calm wasn't accidental, it was architectural. He built a stair for the audience to climb. The staring, the note-taking, the hands folded rather than fists raised. He allowed the other side to own the rush and kept the counterpunch for the moment when everyone had already leaned in. The clip would, of course, distort. It would take a human exchange, flawed, quick, colored by fatigue, and flatten it into hero and foil. That is the penalty and the prize for modern politics. Within hours, hashtags would turn deliberation into a scoreboard. The meticulous scaffolding of Schumer's case would be judged not by CBO tables but by how a line felt in the throat. Kennedy's restraint would be described as savage by those who liked him and smug by those who didn't. Both takes would miss the human truth. Neither man had changed. The room had. By dusk, staffers would be trading drafts like cards, picking between apology and clarification, between doubling down and stepping back. Consultants would argue for contrition. Instinct would argue for pride. None of it would match the velocity of the moment. The nation had already moved on to the replay. And in the replay the roles had hardened. One man sounding like government, the other man sounding like the governed. The reality was more complicated. The perception was not. Perception wins. What carried through those 37 seconds wasn't a policy preference, it was a posture. Americans can sniff posture through a lens like bloodhounds. They know when someone is auditioning for history and when someone is addressing the grocery list. Schumer's steadiness, admirable on a good day, looked like patience to some and condescension to others. Kennedy's patience, novel in that room, read as defiance to some and discipline to others. In the arithmetic of narrative, discipline beats condescension 9 times out of 10. And yet the budget remained the budget. Numbers will still demand their pound of flesh. Agencies would open or not. Families would be made whole or not. The Senate would gavel, adjourn, reconvene, and try again. The country would return to work even if the government hadn't. The moment didn't fix any of that. What it did do was remind a jaded crowd that attention still bends toward authenticity, even performed authenticity. Even curated calm. Sincerity in Washington is often a matter of convincing an audience you meant it, sometimes meaning it is the only way to convince them. The lesson was not about who shouted whom down. It was about who held the room without raising a voice. The chamber's acoustics were built for oratory, not for what Kennedy did. He turned the place into a courtroom, then a living room, then a kitchen table where math and memory meet in the cracks of a month. He made the floor feel smaller in a way that felt like accountability rather than diminishment. He made the cameras feel less like surveillance and more like witness. That is why the silence did not dissipate when the gavel tried to restore order. It had been earned, and earned silence lingers. The reporters in the gallery wrote about it as if it were weather, low pressure building across the middle of the country. A front moving east. Expect gusts by prime time. The headlines would get the adjectives wrong and the nouns right. The pundits would miss the tempo and nail the trope. None of it would change the fact that for just over half a minute, the United States Senate remembered what attention feels like when it isn't coerced. Schumer would recover. Because veterans do. He would resume his argument. Because that is his craft. He would stitch numbers to stories until the math looked humane and the humane looked solvent. He would call it stability again. Because there is no better word for what he believes the country needs. And he would not be wrong. Kennedy would refuse victory laps. Because overexposure ruins clean lines. He would let the quote breathe without strangling it with interviews. He would go back to his desk and his yellow pad and the sweet, dangerous habit of treating government like a balance sheet and politics like a language best spoken in plain subject and verb. He would call it accountability again. Because there is no better word for what he believes the country demands. And he would not be wrong. The shutdown would stain everything. The clip would gild one corner of it. The American appetite for moments would be fed. The American appetite for competence would continue to starve or be satisfied depending on which day the viewer tuned in. The moment would be taught as a lesson in composure by staff schools that never admit their schools. The 37 seconds would join a long shelf of miniature myths, filibusters that weren't, confrontations that edited themselves into legend, because nations tell themselves stories to survive their own contradictions. Still, for those who sat under the dome that morning, the memory would be less myth and more texture. The dry click of a camera focus. The metallic echo of a gavel that suddenly sounded like it belonged to a smaller room. The way aides stopped mid-stride because silence did something to their feet. The way colleagues on both sides looked down not out of shame but because eye contact in a moment like that risks communion. And communion is dangerous in a town built on teams. The country saw a quote. The chamber felt a recalibration. And somewhere between those two truths lies the reason the moment mattered. Not because it settled a bill or opened a gate, but because it demonstrated a primitive, enduring fact about power. Power is not just volume or vote count or committee gavels. Power is the capacity to make a room wait for you to speak, and then to make the speaking feel like a release instead of a performance. That is what the 37 seconds did. They taught a lesson the city hates to relearn. Attention is not entitlement. Respect is not a seniority perk. The audience doesn't owe you their ears just because the microphone is on. You must earn the silence before you break it. And when you break it, you have exactly the length of a breath to say something that sounds like it was meant for the people paying the bill. The shutdown would end or it wouldn't. The votes would be counted or traded. The clip would rise and fall through the feeds, then calcify into memory. But the quiet would linger in the bones of the room. A reminder that there is a kind of leadership that can't be tallied on a whip sheet. The sort that waits, that lets the country lean in, that spends its political capital on clarity rather than applause. The sort that knows a line lands hardest when it arrives wrapped in stillness. And so the hook of the day, the caption, the trend, the monetized reaction, would live its internet half-life. Meanwhile, under the lights that never warmed the room, staff would tape fresh name placards onto fresh hearings, and senators would compose fresh seriousness for fresh cameras. But when a future confrontation began to slide into theater, some old instinct would surface. A hand would pause above the mic. A heartbeat would slow. Someone would remember those 37 seconds and the way a nation listened because, for once, it felt like somebody in that room remembered who owned it. Washington runs on repetition. Hearings, votes, statements, rebuttals. Each one layered over the next until even outrage sounds rehearsed. But every few years, A moment appears that cuts clean through the pattern. And everyone feels it. The brief vertigo when a story stops being managed and starts being lived. The 37 seconds between Schumer's command and Kennedy's reply had become that sort of fault line. By morning, the city was divided into two camps, those trying to spin it and those trying to understand why it mattered so much. Cable panels filled the silence with adjectives. Consultants scrolled sentiment charts like weather maps. Social media managers built montages, looping the pause again and again, trying to capture the geometry of composure. None of them grasped that the power of the clip lay not in what was said but in what wasn't. The absence of noise had embarrassed a place addicted to it. Inside the Capitol, staffers moved through hallways dense with camera crews. Every microphone held the same question. Was it disrespect or misinterpretation? The answers changed nothing. A single phrase had slipped the leash of intention. Context was bleeding out faster than anyone could bandage it. Schumer's office worked like an emergency room. Draft statements multiplied on printers, each version softer than the last. Advisors argued over whether to apologize outright or frame the remark as procedural shorthand. The senator, a man accustomed to controlling tempo, now faced an opponent immune to noise. Kennedy had gone quiet again, leaving only the image of him standing calm while the rest of Washington fidgeted itself into panic. The Louisiana office told reporters he was back home meeting constituents. In reality, he was on a flight, the window shades down, rereading letters from families about lost paychecks and shuttered parks. The shutdown wasn't theory in those pages. It was missed rent, postponed surgery, overdue tuition. He underlined phrases, circled numbers. The silence that had unsettled the Senate wasn't born of calculation. It was fed by these words. By the ordinary math of ordinary lives. By the second day, polls shifted, not dramatically, just enough to remind strategists that narrative moves faster than policy. Schumer's favorables slipped 3 points. Kennedy's rose 5. Commentators framed it as authenticity fatigue, the public's hunger for anyone who sounded unfiltered, even if the filter was the only thing keeping the institution coherent. Pundits named it the 37-second lesson. Training seminars would soon be built around it. Pause before you pounce, harnessing silence in public debate. Meanwhile, the shutdown dragged on. Federal buildings stayed dark, paychecks stayed missing, and yet the national conversation orbited the Senate floor like a satellite trapped in gravitational pull. Each replay of the moment drew eyes away from the spreadsheets of suffering that had filled Kennedy's inbox. He knew this contradiction. He also knew momentum when he felt it. A well-timed truth, even one born in silence, could pry open a larger argument if wielded carefully. 3 mornings later, a budget committee hearing convened to resume negotiations. The room was fuller than usual, not because of substance but spectacle. Reporters filled every bench, hoping for a sequel. The chairman opened with the rote civility of parliamentary routine. But the tension was thick enough to taste. Schumer entered last, face composed, suit sharper than the day of the slip. Kennedy was already there, expression unreadable, a legal pad balanced on his knee. The conversation began politely, amendments, offsets, fiscal projections, yet beneath the data ran a current of theater. Each side spoke not only to the record but to the lens. Every glance toward a camera was a calculation. Every note scribbled was potential ammunition. The entire city had become an audience pretending to be an arbiter. When Kennedy's turn arrived, he didn't reference the insult. He talked numbers, line items, ratios that defined whether a government could call itself solvent. The language was spare, almost clinical, but within it was accusation. The idea that Washington's compassion often came itemized with someone else's paycheck attached. He spoke of towns where the term continuing resolution translated to continuing uncertainty. Of teachers waiting for reimbursements that never came. Of contractors who discovered patriotism didn't pay late fees. Schumer listened, jaw tight. His aides watched him like pilots watching turbulence, waiting to see if the plane would level. When it was his turn, He returned to principle, the obligation to protect, the moral weight of governance, the arithmetic of empathy. His tone was practiced perfection, the very quality that had made him powerful, and the very quality that now made him sound detached. The audience outside the Beltway no longer heard stewardship, they heard sermon. The cameras recorded both men, but only one seemed to know how stillness reads on screen. Kennedy's pauses functioned like punctuation marks the viewer could feel. Each gap invited the listener to fill it with their own frustration, their own grocery receipt. Schumer's flow, smooth and uninterrupted, left no room for participation. It was a lecture. Kennedy's was a conversation. By evening, new clips surfaced. Side angles, close-ups, lip-read analyses of expressions. Commentators spoke of optics of authenticity. Political psychologists were interviewed about body language. The words, working-class cadence, and elitist diction appeared in headlines as if tone itself were ideology. Somewhere amid the dissection, the policy vanished. The country was watching character, not legislation. Backroom strategists urged Schumer to pivot. A televised town hall could show warmth. One suggested, a visit to a closed factory could restore empathy. Said another, he agreed to both, but nothing reversed the visual of that silence. Every fresh camera angle only reminded viewers of the pause that had already defined them. Kennedy, for his part, declined interviews. Let it breathe, his communications director advised. He nodded. The less he said, the more they replayed what he'd already said. Within a week, the Senate received more public correspondence than during the entire previous fiscal quarter. Letters came in brown envelopes, emails by the thousands, all variations of a single theme. Finally someone said it plain. Some praised Schumer's policy but admitted fatigue with performance. Others hailed Kennedy as a folk hero. What united them was exhaustion, with inflation, with paralysis, with a government that felt like theater performed for a shrinking audience. The shift unnerved both parties. Leadership meetings turned into postmortems on communication. Younger senators studied the clip as if decoding scripture. What angle caught the first blink? What second of silence tipped opinion? Speechwriters dissected syntax, chasing the impossible formula for sounding unrehearsed on purpose. The paradox deepened. How to bottle spontaneity without killing it. Outside the Beltway, mayors and governors borrowed the rhetoric. Stand up again became a line in stump speeches from Ohio to Oregon. Talk radio turned it into shorthand for economic self-reliance. What began as a Senate scuffle had metastasized into a slogan, detached from its source but charged with populist electricity. The shutdown still hurt families, but now it had a protagonist. Schumer recognized the danger, the transformation of governance into narrative. He met privately with moderates from both parties, urging them to refocus on reopening the government before rhetoric consumed substance entirely. They listened politely, then asked about polls. Even sincerity sounded strategic by then. In a city where perception writes legislation, numbers rule compassion. Late that night, in his office overlooking Constitution Avenue, Schumer watched the replay once more. No sound, just the flicker of silence stretched across the chamber. He noted the posture, the slight incline of Kennedy's head, the steady hands. It wasn't defiance that undid him. He realized, it was composure. The public had seen calm as courage. His own calm had looked like control. One invited trust, the other demanded it. He closed the screen, adjusted his tie out of habit, and turned to the stack of proposals on his desk. The numbers were the same, the crisis unchanged, but the world reading them had shifted. Words would have to do more than explain, they would have to feel. It was a lesson even veterans still had to learn. By dawn, both camps were drafting new speeches for the next vote. The budget would pass eventually. Stripped down, repackaged, renamed. The moment, however, would remain unamended. A reference point for every future debate on how to win without speaking louder. The city had rediscovered its oldest paradox, silence. when wielded with conviction, can sound like leadership. By the end of the second week, Washington had stopped arguing policy and started arguing mythology. The moment had grown larger than the men who made it. Every network, every late-night monologue, every podcast replayed those 37 seconds like a national Rorschach test. What people saw in the silence said more about them than about the senators themselves. The narrative hardened fast. To one side, Kennedy was the country's conscience, plainspoken, unafraid, the voice of taxpayers who felt unseen. To the other, he was opportunism with a Southern accent, a man who had mastered sincerity like an instrument. Schumer, meanwhile, became a mirror image in reverse, to some, the last adult in a room of showmen; to others, a relic of a system so insulated it mistook composure for connection. It was not the kind of fame either man wanted, but it was the kind neither could avoid. The story consumed the airwaves. Analysts diagrammed body language frame by frame. Pundits debated whether Kennedy's silence was instinct or strategy. Old clips surfaced. Schumer's speeches from the financial crisis years. Kennedy's floor jokes about federal waste, as if each could reveal the genetic code of the confrontation. Cable shows split screens, one side looping the phrase "sit down, boy," the other showing Kennedy's stillness. Slowed to cinematic tempo, captions screamed 37 seconds that shook the Senate. Every outlet had its own moral, its own merchandise, its own certainty. Kennedy refused invitations. He told his staff the story would burn itself out faster if he didn't feed it. Instead, the abstinence became mystique. Silence turned into narrative oxygen. Schumer, cornered by reporters, tried to explain context, fatigue, frustration, misheard phrasing, but explanations rarely trend. Each clarification sounded like confession. Late-night hosts joked that Schumer had met his match in the quietest filibuster in history. Memes spliced the moment with movie clips. Clint Eastwood squinting, Gary Cooper standing alone in high noon. In less than a week, Kennedy had become a symbol, willingly or not, of unpolished defiance. Inside Senate offices, aides whispered about rebranding. Democrats rehearsed contrition. Republicans rehearsed restraint. One strategist proposed that Schumer make an appearance with Kennedy to show unity. Another countered that any shared stage would only deepen the contrast. In politics, even apologies are set design. Kennedy's team operated differently. They saw the storm as validation, proof that authenticity still worked. But even they understood that lightning burns whatever it touches. Their goal was to harness the charge without getting fried. Draft speeches circulated quietly, stripped of humor, heavy on policy. If the public saw him as truth-teller, he'd need numbers sharp enough to match the myth. The senator himself kept to routine, committee work, constituent calls, a visit to a veterans hospital that he'd promised months earlier. Cameras followed anyway. Reporters noted how he greeted janitors by name, how he lingered to listen. They turned courtesy into narrative. Every act became part of the legend they were building for him. Schumer, meanwhile, held strategy dinners with senior staff. The tone was clinical. The problem wasn't the insult, he insisted. The problem was the frame. A system where emotion outpaced fact, where timing trumped truth. Yet he could feel the frustration tightening around him. Years of experience meant little against a meme. The Senate reconvened for what should have been a procedural vote to reopen the government. Instead, it felt like a rematch. The galleries were full. Cameras lined the back wall like rifles aimed at history. The vice president called for order, but the room hummed with anticipation. Schumer went first. His voice, practiced but sincere, outlined the states. Families without paychecks. Small businesses gasping for credit. The fragile trust that held a nation together. It was measured, dignified, everything a civics textbook would applaud. But the air was wrong for dignity. The country wasn't in the mood for balance. It wanted blood or redemption. When Kennedy rose, the hum turned electric. He didn't mention the previous exchange. He spoke of the shutdown's collateral damage, park rangers in debt, border agents working without pay, veterans whose claims sat unprocessed. His words were gentle, almost pastoral, but each sentence carried an undercurrent that the Capitol had lost its sense of proportion. That common sense had been traded for headlines. The chamber listened, not because of what he promised but because he didn't sound like he was promising anything. The cadence of his drawl, slow and deliberate, felt like rebellion against the tempo of Washington itself. When he finished, he didn't wait for applause. He gathered his notes, gave a small nod toward the chair, and sat. The silence afterward was thicker than the noise that followed the first confrontation. Even Schumer, weary and wary, couldn't find the rhythm to rebut it. Across America, households that rarely tuned into C-SPAN were now quoting Senate exchanges at breakfast tables. Kennedy's line about standing up again printed on T-shirts, bumper stickers, and coffee mugs. Schumer's misstep became political shorthand, invoked by every talk radio caller tired of being spoken over. Pollsters found something unexpected. The divide wasn't partisan, it was tonal. Voters said they trusted whoever sounded real, regardless of ideology. The consultants had no metric for that. Editorial boards tried to restore balance, reminding readers that budgets decide hospitals, not hashtags. But the narrative had slipped from their grasp. What mattered wasn't the bill, it was the moment, a small rebellion against professional certainty. Kennedy returned to his office long after the cameras left. He sat at the window overlooking the Capitol dome, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The letters from constituents lay open on his desk, creased and fingerprinted. He read them again. The teacher in Baton Rouge, the mechanic from Shreveport, and wondered whether they'd see any difference once the lights dimmed and the votes were tallied. He knew the truth that no viral clip could capture, that the machine would keep grinding, that the same bills would return under new names, that the shutdown would end not with a revelation but a compromise. But for one brief moment, he had forced the institution to listen, and that, in a town addicted to its own echo, felt like revolution enough. Schumer, in his own office, stared at the same dome from the opposite side. He thought of the decades spent mastering procedure, the long nights of negotiation, the belief that reason always won in the end. Watching the replay in silence, he recognized something painful, that in a world ruled by cameras, even reason needed theater. By the weekend, a tentative budget passed, the shutdown ended, the agencies reopened, and the headlines moved on. But something fundamental had shifted. Washington had learned that in the age of perpetual broadcast, power wasn't just what you said, it was how long you could stay quiet after saying it. The legend of 37 seconds had become part of the city's folklore. Quoted in training sessions, campaign rallies, and communication courses, it wasn't a victory or a loss. It was a warning that sometimes the loudest truth arrives dressed as silence, and that a single calm voice, timed perfectly, can make the entire room remember why it's supposed to listen. By the time the echo of that Senate exchange faded from the chamber walls, Washington itself had become the echo. The moment lived in the air like static, replayed, dissected, misunderstood, and finally mythologized. It was no longer about what had been said or meant. It was about the pause, the stillness that made every word afterward sound smaller. Across the Capitol, screens looped the same 37 seconds. Commentators spoke as if decoding scripture, parsing facial expressions, measuring breaths. Some called it defiance, others restraint, but everyone agreed it was unforgettable. Kennedy's composure had become a kind of gravity, pulling everything else into its orbit. Schumer moved through the corridors like a man carrying invisible weight. He spoke softly to reporters, framing his remark as a slip born of exhaustion. His staff produced careful statements filled with respect and regret. But in a city built on performance, sincerity is a language easily misheard. Every apology looked like damage control, every explanation like an admission. He could feel the shift in temperature. Crowded elevators went silent when he entered. Even allies spoke to him in measured tones, as if loud voices might make the story flare again. Kennedy, by contrast, said nothing. He attended committee meetings, shook hands with tourists in the rotunda, read letters from home. He gave no interviews, offered no speeches, and yet his absence from the conversation only deepened it. Reporters began describing him in the language reserved for folk heroes. The quiet senator who stood for 37 seconds became a symbol for everyone who had ever felt ignored by the system. He hadn't planned it. He didn't even understand the full reach of it until aides began showing him headlines from cities he'd never visited. In living rooms and diners, people repeated his words like a prayer they finally remembered. Inside the Senate, the atmosphere thickened. Hearings turned cautious. Every phrase weighed for tone as much as content. Senators paused longer before responding to one another, afraid of birthing another viral silence. The press gallery watched for tremors, ready to crown a new moment. Schumer resumed his duties, each motion deliberate, each statement polished to neutrality. But cameras lingered on his face longer than before, searching for signs of vulnerability. The city's obsession with perception had consumed the reality it once described. When the next session opened, the chamber was packed, the shutdown negotiations had resumed, and the nation watched as if tuning into a sequel. Schumer spoke first, his voice calm, measured, precise. He invoked duty, compromise, and compassion. His sentences had weight but no spark. They landed softly, like rehearsed lines in a play everyone already knew. Kennedy listened without expression. When it was his turn, he stood, straightened his jacket, and began with numbers, deficits, budgets, the slow arithmetic of accountability. The rhythm was plain, the delivery almost gentle, but beneath it lay a quiet indictment. Washington had mistaken activity for progress, compassion for control, words for work. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence between sentences carried its own authority. By the time he finished, the room was still again. Schumer offered a brief nod, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fatigue. There was no confrontation this time, no spark, yet everyone present felt something irreversible had shifted. Kennedy had changed the vocabulary of politics without changing a single policy. He had made stillness a weapon. Beyond the marble corridors, the story multiplied. Commentators built theories about authenticity. Authenticity became branding, and branding turned into belief. Kennedy's phrase about standing up again appeared on signs and coffee mugs, on talk shows and protest placards. It transcended the shutdown and became shorthand for frustration itself. Schumer's name, meanwhile, turned into a cautionary footnote, a reminder that even mastery can't survive a single careless syllable. One night, after the vote to reopen the government finally passed, Kennedy sat alone in his office overlooking the Capitol dome. The city outside was quiet. Papers lay scattered across his desk, letters, statistics, drafts of speeches he would never deliver. He thought of the people whose names filled those envelopes, the families who had waited for the lights of their government to come back on. He knew their lives would change little because of a viral moment. But he also knew the value of being heard, even once. Across town, Schumer did the same, sitting in an office lined with awards and framed bills. The building hummed faintly around him, the sound of cleaning crews and fluorescent lights. He replayed the clip again, this time without sound, watching his own mouth move, Kennedy's stillness on the other side. The lesson was there, unsparing and simple. In a world ruled by noise, the man who pauses owns the room. Outside, Washington returned to motion. Committees met, bills were filed, cameras moved on, but the city remembered. Somewhere between outrage and exhaustion, it had discovered something older than either, a hunger for honesty unpolished by design. And though the next debate would bring new words, new tempers, and new stories, those 37 seconds remained, echoing quietly through every hallway that ever claimed to speak for the people. By the time the headlines dimmed and the budget passed, The silence between Kennedy and Schumer had hardened into legend. What had begun as a fleeting exchange inside a marble chamber now echoed across coffee shops, truck stops, classrooms, and factory floors. People didn't quote the policy, they quoted the pause. In that stillness, they heard something Washington hadn't produced in years, a moment that felt unscripted. The country had been starved for that feeling, and it devoured it whole. In the weeks that followed, the Senate seemed to move slower, as if every sentence carried the weight of potential history. Senators who once thrived on grandstanding spoke more cautiously, measuring their pauses, fearing the camera would catch them saying too much or too little. Staffers drafted lines meant to sound spontaneous. Consultants ran workshops titled How to Sound Real in a Digital Age. The irony was complete. Kennedy stayed on the road, slipping into diners and town halls without the armor of press releases. He spoke softly about small things, roads that needed fixing, children without textbooks, families who lived paycheck to paycheck. Reporters followed, scribbling down his every word, searching for the next viral line. But he never gave them one. His restraint became its own mythology. The less he said, the more people believed he was saying something profound. Schumer's world, by contrast, shrank. Inside his office, meetings turned brittle. Allies offered sympathy without warmth. His name had become shorthand for arrogance. His every gesture scrutinized for recovery or relapse. He tried to shift attention back to legislation, to remind colleagues that governance required endurance. Not moments, but endurance doesn't trend. A soundbite does. He had been in politics long enough to know that perception, once shaped, rarely bends back. On a winter morning, the two men met again by accident in a Capitol hallway. There were no cameras, no aides, no witnesses, just the sound of their shoes on tile and the hum of fluorescent light. They nodded, both understanding the unspoken truth, that neither had really won. The chamber had changed, but not for the better. The noise was quieter now, yet somehow emptier. The people no longer listened for solutions, they listened for sound. Outside the city, the phrase "stand up again" continued its pilgrimage through the culture. It appeared in campaign slogans, church sermons, even corporate commercials. What had once been an indictment became a brand, stripped of its original weight. Kennedy watched this with quiet discomfort. He hadn't meant to start a movement, only to tell the truth as he saw it. But truth, once filmed, belonged to everyone else. The Senate returned to its routines. Committees resumed. The press moved on. Yet beneath the normalcy, a new kind of caution settled in. Every senator knew now that the smallest misstep could outlive them, that a single sentence might define a career. The marble walls had always been built to echo, but now the echo had escaped the building and spread into every phone, every feed, every corner of the country. Kennedy spent more evenings alone, reading the same letters that had first shaped his resolve. The words reminded him why he'd spoken up, why silence had mattered. He wasn't naive. He knew the machine would keep grinding. That noise would return, louder and emptier than before. But for a brief moment, the people had seen through it. That was enough. Schumer, somewhere in the same maze of corridors, stayed late too. He reviewed drafts, adjusted phrasing, practiced the art of being careful. Every speech was now a negotiation between meaning and optics. Every pause, a calculation. He missed the days when words could simply be spoken, when the public listened with patience instead of anticipation. But the age of patience was over. Outside, the Capitol dome gleamed against the night sky, serene and indifferent. Beneath it, two men who had reshaped the country's conversation in 37 seconds sat in separate offices, haunted by the same realization that power had changed form. It no longer lived in votes or budgets. It lived in moments, in silence, in the fragile space between outrage and understanding. And no one, not even them, truly controlled it anymore. The story had ended where it began. One chamber, two voices, and a silence that refused to fade. What followed was not victory or defeat, but a lesson buried deep in the marble of the Senate floor, that sometimes the smallest pause in the noisiest room can become the loudest sound a nation ever hears. The echo lingered long after the applause faded. Kennedy's words, simple and sharp, had been folded into the nation's bloodstream. They were printed, shared, sung, and misquoted, their meaning reshaped by every pair of hands that passed them along. What began as one senator's defiance had become folklore. The story no longer belonged to the chamber. It belonged to the people who needed to believe that truth could still stand its ground inside marble walls. In Washington, that belief became both weapon and burden. Every committee hearing now unfolded like theater under floodlights. Senators rehearsed indignation and humility in equal measure. Speechwriters studied Kennedy's cadence, chasing the illusion of unfiltered honesty. Even silence became strategy, a rehearsed pause, a deliberate breath, a performance of restraint. Kennedy watched it all with quiet unease. He had wanted clarity, not imitation, but in a city built on reflection, even sincerity was copied like a headline. Schumer worked longer hours. His staff avoided the subject, but every conversation circled it like a ghost. In private, he admitted to himself that he'd underestimated the power of perception. For decades, he'd believed that facts could win on their own. But this new age belonged to moments, to frames, not paragraphs, to symbols, not sentences. He still believed in governance, in patience, in reason, yet even he could feel the current pulling him toward spectacle. The chamber no longer rewarded the steady hand. It rewarded the sound that cut through the noise, even if it added nothing to the solution. When the two men crossed paths again in an empty corridor, they exchanged the briefest of nods. No bitterness, no triumph, just recognition. Each had become something larger than himself, an emblem of the country's argument with itself. Kennedy represented the voice that refused to kneel to institutions. Schumer embodied the institution struggling to remember why it mattered. Between them stretched the divide every voter felt but couldn't name. Outside, the city pulsed with a strange kind of silence. Tourists stood where it happened, peering through gallery windows as if the Senate were a museum of vanished civility. News anchors filled the quiet with speculation, analysts with context, citizens with fury, yet beneath the noise was fatigue, the slow exhaustion of a nation that had been listening for meaning too long. In Louisiana, Kennedy sat on his porch one evening as the light faded. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. The letters from his office sat unopened on the table beside him. Somewhere inside those envelopes were invitations, interviews, maybe even a presidential draft. But all he wanted was the stillness, the same stillness that had started everything. He understood now what it had cost him. The moment that made him immortal had also made him a relic of something disappearing. Authenticity without agenda. Across the country, Schumer read a late editorial calling the event, "The last honest silence in politics." He closed the paper without finishing it. The phrase unsettled him. If silence was honesty now, what did that make speech? He stood by the window, watching the Capitol dome glow in the distance. Its light was steady, but the ground beneath it had shifted. He wondered if anyone would notice when the foundation finally cracked. Months later, when the next crisis came, as they always did, both men took the floor again. The chamber was quieter this time. There were no viral clips, no trending hashtags, no thunderous confrontations. The country had moved on, but the lesson remained etched in the marble. When Kennedy rose to speak, every senator listened, not for spectacle, not for fury, but for truth, however brief it might be. His words came measured, careful, human. They were not crafted to break the internet. They were meant to remind it that somewhere between outrage and apathy still lived the fragile pulse of democracy. And as he sat down, the chamber exhaled. For a fleeting second, it felt like a place of purpose again, imperfect, loud, flawed, but still capable of listening. That was the victory neither man had expected. The quiet triumph buried beneath the noise. The cameras caught none of it. No one tweeted. No one trended. It was too small, too ordinary, too human to become content. But for those who were there, the sound of that brief, collective silence was the most extraordinary thing they had heard in years. The marble walls kept the echo. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.